The next briefing, by the way, is one on the Land Development Code.
As staff makes their way up to the dais, I'll just remind council members that this is an ongoing discussion about the efforts that we have been undertaking on revising the Land Development Code. There have been a couple of meetings and briefings since we had our last work session, and so we wanted to give you an update on that, and then a preview on some of the upcoming discussions that we'll be having, not only with you, but with the community. So with that, I'll pass it over to Assistant City Manager Rodney Gonzalez.
Thank you, Spencer. Assistant City Manager Rodney Gonzalez for Economic Opportunity and Affordability. Mayor and Council, you may recall that we came to work session on August 6th, gave a brief update of the status of the Land Development Code Revision Project. And we're here again, of course, to talk about what we've done since that time and what's on the horizon. So with me today, of course, are Anik Baudet and Brent Lloyd and other staff that are working on the project as well. Thank you.
Good morning, Mayor and Council.
Morning.
Anik Baudet, and I'm going to briefly go over the schedule in the red box in the lower middle. We're here today at work session, and moving forward, we have a special called work session on the 28th next week to deep dive on a few topics that I'll go into here in a second. But it's important to note on the time frame altogether that was released in late July that we are busy at work implementing the May 2nd council direction. But that also includes, I want to be clear that in the May 2nd council direction, there was direction to review past boards and commission recommendation on our previous work, which there were a lot of recommendations, and we have been cataloging those similar to the process that you all are familiar with the Austin Strategic Mobility Plan. But we've had the luxury in the last year of multiple equity-focused reports being released, Uprooted, the Anti-Displacement Task Force recommendations. We've been reviewing those recommendations as well and including them in our analysis as we move forward with code development. So we are still on track moving forward with a release on October 4th of a digital version of text and a map, as well as an in-depth staff report that catalogs our approach to implementing your direction. During the month of October, we'll have 3 types of participation with the public: open houses, office hours, and public testing. So that will all happen in October, leading to the date that is on the timeline of an October 26th Planning Commission public hearing, moving towards a November council public hearing, and moving forward to a December 1st reading. So that's an overcap of the schedule. So for today, we plan to recap for you. We were at the Housing and Planning Committee on August 13th with an in-depth approach to housing capacity and the relationship to zoning and how we're handling housing capacity with zoning in the code. So I'll go over what those topics were. Today, we're going to spend 5 or 6 minutes on an overarching approach to housing capacity that we're taking in service to your direction, and then talk about next steps. So at the Housing and Planning Committee on August 13th, we went in depth on a reminder on the zoning categories that are included in the Land Development Code revision effort at this time. We talked about how we're handling residential uses in a new way along corridors. We talked about the preservation incentive and how we're implementing that. We talked a lot about accessory dwelling units and duplexes and some details related to those 2 types of housing, of multi-unit housing scale product. We talked about single-family and multifamily uses, and then about our new approach to non-conforming in the transition zones with this idea of a, quote, compliant use that we're still working out the exact name, but the idea that single family would be compliant in the transition zone. So we do have those slides loaded up for those who aren't on the committee. If there's any questions related to any of these items later in the presentation, we can pull them up, and Senior Planner Lindy Garwood is here, who delivered most of this, and she's able to walk through those if anyone has any questions on those. So with that, I'm going to hand the presentation over to co-lead Brent Lloyd to talk about our general approach to increasing housing capacity and service to council direction.
Thanks, Mayor and Council. Brent Lloyd, Development Services Department Development Officer. and I'm going to walk through some of the key concepts that are driving the mapping and the other code changes that will be before you in October. And we've, as with most of our slides, we try to restate your direction from May 2nd at the top. And rather than reread that direction, I want to just sort of distill down what I think some are the key themes that have that are informing the mapping and the text changes as well. And I think Council's direction points towards, to the greatest extent possible, having new entitlements focus on transition areas and be tied to an affordable housing density bonus. If that proves not to be economically viable within the transition areas, if a density bonus would prevent missing middle housing from occurring, then new by rights entitlements may be available in the transition areas. Outside of transition areas, the bar is to be far higher for obtaining new entitlements, and the city will focus on requiring participation in a density bonus. And within areas that are susceptible to gentrification, as indicated in the UT Uprooted study, generally no mapping changes will be provided, and participation, obtaining new entitlements will require participation in a citywide density bonus program, and the zoning will generally conform with comparable zoning to what exists today. So with that background in mind, let's talk a little bit about current code. Current code does not provide sufficient housing capacity. All of the information that we received in the course of our prior work has indicated that, and there aren't tools available under the current code to significantly increase capacity on a citywide basis, as we believe and our consultants have indicated needs to occur to help to address affordability concerns. So the goal is, with the new code, with a new zoning map, we have a chance to really provide some additional capacity and address the issues. Draft 3, the prior work, the approach to housing capacity did not include transition areas. There were definitely enhancements provided on a citywide basis and changes that would have provided additional capacity, but there wasn't the focused effort that is reflected in the concept of transition areas that also plays into other city planning goals, notably transportation. Also, our prior work lacked the benefit of the recent in-depth gentrification studies and data, I think, that will inform the discussion going forward on the map as well as the text. So potential revisions include maintaining current base zoning capacity except in transition zones, where that is to focus on principally providing missing middle housing. And it's worth noting that this, although not indicated on the slide, I want to emphasize that this includes downtown. We'll be talking more about the downtown area going forward, but downtown is not intended under the code to have substantial increases in density. And again, the transition areas are intended to really focus on allowing new missing middle housing types. And then finally, and I think most importantly, is apply zones in areas susceptible to displacement very carefully, and that should be guided by the Uprooted study that UT prepared. So the effect of the changes that are under consideration are to increase housing capacity to improve jobs, housing balance, and provide tools to allow for more affordable housing. More housing close to transit corridors, as I mentioned, is critical to other city planning goals. We want to talk about housing capacity as a concept, which the city manager discussed in the March 15th memo that was led to your policy direction on May 2nd. And I think housing capacity is a critical concept that will be discussed in other work sessions and going forward after the code is released as well. Fundamentally, to recap, the yield goal is 135,000 new units and 60,000 affordable units at 80% MFI. The current code capacity provides for 145,000 units. In our prior work, the yield goal was 135,000 units with 60,000 units affordable at 80%, and that resulted in a capacity of approximately 287,000 units, twice twice the goal. And the potential revisions that are being focused on, informed by council's policy direction quoted at the top of this slide, is, again, to achieve the 135,000 new units with 60,000 affordable units. And to achieve that target, we're shooting for a capacity per council's direction of 405,000 new units, and that's 3 times the goal. So the effect of this change is that by planning for 3 times the capacity, we're more likely to reach the yield goal. Greater yield of market rate units will facilitate more affordable units. And just to sort of restate and paraphrase some concepts that are, I think, critical to the idea of housing capacity and that we'll be revisiting going forward, is that in order to achieve a yield goal, it's necessary to provide for more opportunities for development and provide for a buffer and provide for greater capacity, as there are many situations where even though properties have entitlements, the stars will not all align in a manner that results in additional development that provides housing capacity. So it's necessary for those sorts of reasons to provide a buffer and to provide additional capacity. Additionally, our consultants have advised us consistently in our prior work, as well as in the context of this process, that providing more market rate units is essential to providing more affordable units. And that plays in as well to the need to generally provide greater housing capacity, which is very much the focus of council's direction and will be reflected in the map that comes out in October.
For next steps, we will be at Mobility Committee. We'll be at Mobility Committee tomorrow, actually, and talking mostly about the approach in the transportation chapter about comprehensive transportation review, which includes transportation demand management, transportation impact analysis, and our new approaches per the council direction on those items. And then for work session on the 28th, we have a robust 4 items. Our consultant, Peter Park, will be here to assist us with these items, specifically our approach to the transition zones, parking, how we are looking at the council direction on parking, some information on what we're developing related to non-zoning regulations, such as parkland and watershed. And then also our approach to downtown. We've been doing, as I said before in the last presentation, inherent to developing a code is a lot of listening to the community, but also inherent testing of ideas. So we've done some testing, not only of citywide, but also specific to the downtown that we'd like to share with you all on the 28th. So with that, we'll be happy to answer questions that you may have. And again, we have the slides loaded on the past categories from housing and planning if anyone would like to ask questions on those. Thank you.
Okay. I want to thank you for this presentation and for the one in front of the council committees. Again, the more we can daylight and elevate over the next 6 weeks so that people, when the maps and the code come out, people already know what to expect and people aren't surprised. The more we can do, I think it's going to best enable and facilitate the process. As you might imagine, already getting lots of calls and emails and folks expressing concern. I'm just going to pick 3 real fast, and if you're not ready to respond to them yet, just say so. But we have some people, I think, that are concerned that if they have a single-family home in a transition area and it's destroyed or it burns down or something like that, but their property's been zoned for transition for a higher use, that they're not going to, their home's gone and they're not going to be able to replace it. Have you all gotten far enough where you have a feel for where you're going to end up on that point?
Brent Lloyd, and that is definitely an issue that is under review as we finalize the draft provisions. I will indicate, though, that per council's direction, it's intended that single-family homes, although they will not be an allowed use in the traditional sense within transition areas, that existing homes be given far greater rights to be maintained, enlarged, and continued than would normally apply to a non-conforming use. And related to that, when you have a non-conforming use, the rules in city code, and this is true today as well as in the draft that will come forward in October, if a house is destroyed by accident or vandalism or something beyond the owner's control, there is an automatic right to rebuild the structure. And so at a bare minimum, I think that council can expect to see in the code that comes forth in October similar rights afforded in those situations. The extent to which there may be limitations on building a single-family home if an owner knowingly, intentionally, completely levels the structure and makes the lot essentially a greenfield condition, that is an issue that is still under review. Council's direction very much points towards trying to encourage the construction of multi-unit development, missing middle housing in transition areas. But Mayor, I think your question and the questions that have percolated through the community points to some of the sensitivities that have to be balanced, and we are certainly considering all those issues.
Sounds good. And I think we did say in the direction that we were trying not to incentivize people tearing down a single-family home to build a really large single-family home. So it's consistent with that. I'm also hearing people ask questions, what if they're in an area in a transition zone that's trying to encourage not a big home being built, but a multifamily project. But there's a deed restriction that says you can't build multifamily. Are you then left with an inability to build anything on your property?
Mayor, that is an issue that we are looking into, and I think that you can rest assured that the code that comes forward in October will have a clear answer to that. But I think there are definitely the core concepts are, as I've discussed here today as well as last week, but I think some of the details have yet to be worked out, and I think your question is a good one, and we will be prepared to answer it as the proposal takes shape.
And we have precedent under law. Even when we passed the SOS ordinance, for example, there were provisions in it that provided that if those ordinances left the landowner in a position where a property owner where they couldn't build anything on their property, that there was then the staff that was not a viable place to be. So staff had to figure out on a case-by-case basis what somebody could do. So I would expect to see something like that. Is that like a reasonable expectation? Okay. There's also a lot of conversation in the community about a map that's been provided that has red lines and yellow lines on it. And as I look at that map, in its legend, it says that it would purport to suggest, it shows what a transition area would look like if it was 400-foot depth at a minimum, up to 1,500-foot depth at a minimum. Do you, at this point, and I know you're going to be talking about transition zones in a week, and I don't want to get ahead of anything, so if this is a bad question for me to ask now, just say that. But do you anticipate having transition zones that go up to like 1,500 feet?
Anique Baudet, the approach to the mapping, we will get into more detail next week, as you stated. As we're developing the code right now, per council direction, no, there are not transition zones that go up to around 1,400 feet. We're taking a very context-sensitive approach and looking very carefully at the criteria given to us by council and applying them diligently. And what we're finding and what you all will find when we release the map, that is a moderate and context-sensitive map that adheres mostly to planning principles and is equitable how we're approaching the transition zones across the city. And we'll be prepared to talk more about what that approach is next week.
Okay, because I think a lot of people are going to be looking at that map to compare it to what you're thinking to see if there's a relationship, or if that map that that's been circulated that we're getting a lot of questions about actually, because a lot of people are concerned about the extent shown in that, and people are trying to gauge whether that's a valid or legitimate concern or not. There was a direction that the council gave that said in no event should any neighborhood be mostly transition zone. And on that map, if you detail down, in some places, most of a neighborhood would be subsumed by one color or the other. Are you taking into account and reflecting the council's intention that no neighborhood should mostly be transition zones?
Yes, that is a guiding factor, and we're looking very carefully at the different depths of neighborhoods as they are adjacent to the corridors as one of the guiding factors, and using that, and again, coming up with our own criteria to apply equitable with
Great.
regards to that.
I look forward to the
Specific
broader
criteria.
conversation on transition zones coming up shortly. And I would also add that, and Manager, we've mentioned this before on this dais, that we were getting together multiple times in September on budget issues and other kinds of things. I, for one, would support if pulling aside 15, 20 minutes for you to be able to report back to the community things that are happening to elevate issues. So don't hesitate to ask for that opportunity, because you'll get that chance.
Thank you. And we're going to take that opportunity next week when we have a special called work session for this specific topic. And where those opportunities for work session arise, where we can give a brief update like today, we certainly want to take those opportunities. And we appreciate you daylighting these concerns to us because, of course, as we've said from the beginning, we want a code that is responsive to the council policy direction, a code that works for the community. And the way that we will get there is by having these open dialogues to air these concerns, so that way we take them into consideration as we draft code.
And that's good. Good to do that, because when a map's out there like that, and it's not a city map, the city didn't, but in the absence of other maps, people get that map and they don't know whether that's an official map or a realistic map or not. So I'm happy that the city's going to come in and address some of those issues too.
And there are concerns that come to us as well, vis-a-vis the community at large. And what we do when we get those concerns is we look at those in the context of the council policy direction that was provided in May. And to the degree that they align, that's our response. And where they don't align, we're very clear with our regard with regard to following council policy direction from May 2nd. That is our guiding principle, the council policy direction from May 2nd. And so that's what you've heard today, is that we are doing everything in response to council policy direction.
Great, thank you. Allison.
Thank you. I wanted to first just comment that I haven't received a notice about the special meeting. I looked in my email, so I don't know if it was just me, but that would be helpful
Okay.
to have. So I had two questions. One relates to takes the part of the potential revisions and asks you to think about it in the context of a specific case. So we talk about this a lot, kind of writ large. We have a case before us in Riverside where there's a lot of debate over exactly how much upzoning is going on relative to what's going on and what the impacts are with respect to displacement. And I know that I'm struggling with that myself to try to piece that together. So given the potential revisions that you're thinking about, how should we be thinking about the proposal that's before us at Riverside? What would your approach tell us in this case we should be doing? So there's multiple pieces of this. There's a piece where they would be getting additional entitlements from 40 to 60, where they didn't have to do any affordability bonus, and then there are situations where they have the additional. I really would like a real answer. I don't want to put you on the spot. We were taking this up again later in our discussion when Riverside was pulled. If it's possible, if you prefer to give me it then and have a few minutes to think about it, I'm fine with that. It's an issue that is part of what we're looking forward to in the Land Development Code, but we have to make a decision, at least on second reading, this week, and so I think it'd be useful.
Councilmember Alter, that's a really good question, a really good case to be inquiring about. There, I think, are some sensitivities to discussing how the code, which has not been released yet, would affect individual properties. But I think that the Riverside case, presents a number of unique factors that probably will recur as the city continues to develop and grow. And so we will find a way to address the core concerns in your question. But I think unless Anik has anything further to add.
I did also want to add, and I don't think we're prepared to give you a full response, and I appreciate your concern with how code intersects in situations like that. I did also want to bring up, and we've talked about this before, how the code by itself is not the solution for instances like that. We recently provided a response to the People's Plan, which spoke to our strategies for displacement, et cetera. And so we want to lead those conversations based on those responses towards displacement and gentrification, and how we might, through programmatic situations, assist when those situations occur.
I still think that we have before us a situation that is exact case. That is what the community is concerned about in this case. And we ought to be able to have some lessons of at least principles we should be thinking about and how this relates. I understand you haven't fully written the code, but it might be good to have a test case here to see how the code will play out. I know we all have places in our district that have market rate affordable units that we're concerned about. And this is a case that's before us, and it has peculiarities because it's a regulating plan, but the opportunity with a land development code rewrite is to be able to look at things in a different way. And so I really, really do want to have some feedback on that, as we proceed on that.
Mayor and Councilmember Alter,
As long as you come back to me afterwards, you're
I
fine.
do want to come back to you. I just don't want to lose
Yeah,
the point if that's
sure.
okay.
Yes, that's fine.
I recognize that the staff, I understand why the staff probably doesn't want to delve into a particular zoning case, but I will, just having tried to reread the council direction a couple times here lately as we get closer, do want to point out, as adopted on May 2nd of 2019, there's an explicit sentence that says, existing market rate affordable multifamily shall not be mapped to be upzoned. So I think that pretty clearly lays out the answer to the question of maybe not this particular zoning case, because the council, of course, can always make lot by lot and case by case determinations. But I think to your question of how did the council direct on May the 2nd that existing market rate affordable housing citywide should be treated as a policy, we have a very specific sentence that is not I'm not making it an argument about this particular zoning case. We can pull that case and we can talk about in specific zoning cases how we want to handle it. But we did as a citywide policy, because I think it's important to be safe on those issues. As a citywide policy, we have that very specific sentence.
I think there's also, there's two parts of it, is what do we do with the market affordable, but then there's also the granting of an entitlement without having to provide any affordability, which was another piece of what the code said. And so that's what I'm struggling with, trying to figure out with this case, but it's also one of the things that I find challenging about the approach to the land development code rewrite. I have another question, but it looks like Mr. Flanagan wanted to
Just very
pop in
quickly,
on that.
there are a lot of direction in the LDC. None of them, we did not rank the requirements in the LDC. We didn't say which ones overrode the other ones. There are also things about density on corridors and transit access, and that particular case is at the intersection of two major transit corridors. And the LDC also does not say that increased entitlements only come with affordability. It's one of the things we want to try to get to, but as we've said before, increased housing at market rate is also something that is a benefit.
And for me on that issue, I agree with that instruction, because I think it's something that we shouldn't be doing as a general rule. And any time that we do that, I think it requires a really specific conversation about it. And I think that's what's happening this week on that project. Allison, sorry.
Thank you. So my second question has to do with page 6, and just when we're talking about affordable units in your charts. Are we talking about income restricted units through density bonus tools, or do you mean that affordability in some other way? Like when you say affordable units, what are we talking about?
Councilmember Alter, I think primarily we're referring to the density bonus. I think it's a goal to have affordable units through the density bonus account for a lot of that 60,000. But I will need to consult with staff and with potentially our consultants as well. And I think actually Erica Leak is prepared to address that question.
Good morning, Erica Leak, Neighborhood Housing. The blueprint goal to have 60,000 units be affordable at 80% median family income or below includes both income restricted and market rate units. The challenge, of course, is that if they're not income restricted in Texas, there's nothing that keeps the rents or the sales price of those units from increasing. So it will always be a challenge in Texas to keep affordability over the long term if it's not income restricted.
So I guess I'm struggling with this notion of greater yield of market rate units will facilitate more affordable units. If we're talking about more than just income restricted units. And even if we're talking about income restricted units, I'm struggling with that because that makes all the land more expensive and other things. So can you provide me with the specific data and analysis that you're using to inform that statement? I'm not saying that we don't need to increase any more supply, but that relationship is stated as if it is factual, and I just need to see the data that is really driving that statement.
There are a variety of studies that talk about the pros and cons of, increased supply, talking about rent control. I mean, I think you could look for data and you would find data that would support a lot of different things. We can certainly share information that we have.
Okay. As I've said before, I think we do need to have some supply, but it matters which type of supply that we want. And when you increase supply too much in one type, which is the market rate, it has impacts for the affordable units that we ignore at our peril. And so I would like to see, what you're basing your choices on, because I'm not fully understanding your conclusion there. Thank you.
Leslie?
The questions that Allison is raising, I've been looking for that data and those examples as well. And you'll remember during some of our conversations last year on the Land Development Code, a couple of us asked our esteemed consultant colleagues to bring us some examples in the city of Austin where increased numbers had resulted in lower rents and suggested a per square foot rental or purchase as a good unit of measure, and we still have not gotten that information. So I think that request is still on the table for staff to bring us, and I think it's really important for us to understand the analytics as we are making these determinations. So can I get a commitment from staff or from the city manager, please, to provide us with that data? I think it's really important. We want to see examples of where the increased numbers of units has actually driven down the cost for folks. I would also like to know, in the timeline, we have opportunities for community input. It's sort of vague, and I think we talked about this when y'all came and met with me one-on-one. So here in public session, I'd like to get an answer to what opportunities for the community will be provided for the community to provide input on the documents after they're released publicly on October 4, after the draft is issued.
Sure. Anique Baudet. As I mentioned earlier, we'll have open houses as well as office hours where individuals can come interact, and they will have had time, hopefully, to look at the map, look around, look at the code text, come up with questions that they may have. And also through questions through the public testing when we do that. We've also been, since May 2nd, meeting with small groups per request, ranging from, say, the Parks Foundations to neighborhood associations and others in between, really in the guideposts of the council direction and having clarity and answering questions around that. But once the code is released after October, there'll be specific questions about that. And so that will be the opportunity. And we anticipate issuing a supplemental to the staff report, similar to what you saw with the strategic mobility plan process, where if we hear an aha moment from the community of something striking that we didn't think of and we agree with it, we will certainly let Planning Commission know that that is something we agree with, and if it's their desire to make that recommendation to you all to edit into the plan, then that will be the process.
So do you have the schedule for the Planning Commission? What date will the draft be
Considered?
presented?
We're looking at Saturday, October 26th for the public hearing for folks to be able to give testimony to the Planning Commission, and I believe they will take a subsequent date for their action after that.
October 26th?
Their action won't be likely on October 26th. It would be in early November.
Okay. So we have, 3 or 4 weeks between then and the meeting in December for a first reading on this?
That's correct.
Is that what the calendar looks like?
That's tentative calendar right now. Is early December for a first reading, correct?
Okay. That feels really tight and might work if we don't have any other all-consuming issues in front of us in some other areas where we can devote our staff time to really working through these specifics. I'm a little worried about that, City Manager. And I don't want to diminish the importance of first reading. I don't want to say, well, it's just first reading, because so often we really do set the template for what it is we're going to actually approve or narrow down the areas where we will make some amendments. So if you might just stay open to the situation, because I think it's really important for us to make sure we have sufficient time for the community to understand what we're doing again. And then so that's one piece of the timeline that I think is key. And then have you revised the codification and the training timeline calendar? Meaning, when we talked about this last year, we were looking at about a 6 to 9 month, potentially a year to get the whole, probably 6 to 9 months to get the whole code rewritten and codified, and then the training for staff in the interpretations and the application of the new code. My understanding last year was the code would not be effective until that time had passed. I wanted to make sure that's still the case.
Councilmember Poole, there definitely, the staff proposal will include some kind of a delayed effective date. You know, as council's aware, normally, if you don't say otherwise, an ordinance goes into effect 10 days after passage. And we definitely will be proposing a delayed effective date. It likely will not be 6 to 9 months, but there certainly will be training necessary. There will be some retooling of applications and criteria manuals, and we will be prepared to brief council on more of the details of those issues going forward.
Okay. And I just want to put that back out on the table for us to be sensitive to that as well. It's another situation where we can't turn that faucet on until everybody's been trained, and because we don't want to make any mistakes. We also need to be aware that when we find issues surfacing like conflicts, when we start to put it into, when we implement, we may find those tricky points that haven't surfaced before. And so I think we should also be aware that we will probably be having to come back and have a slew of reviews for areas where we find either mistakes or internal conflicts that can't otherwise be addressed. So I know I'm looking further down the road than maybe everybody is here today, but I think this is something that the public also needs to understand. They're worried about the timeline, and I want to give as much information, including our opportunities to identify inconsistencies and our determination to address them so that we can fix them. I think that's generally shared from the staff all the way up to the dais. Thanks.
Hey, Jimmy.
A couple of things just to note. There's debate amongst the council members on some of these topics. I would say that I've not seen evidence that adding capacity increases land cost directly, and I've heard at different times whether or not the appraisal district even looks at zoning when they're setting values. I haven't gotten an actual answer to that question yet, so I don't know that that's necessarily where I'm coming from. Also, that increasing supply hurts affordable units. Councilmember Alter, I'm not sure what you're referring to, so maybe you have some insight on what specifically you meant by that. Also, when we're looking for examples of increased supply lowering the rent, we have to look outside of Austin. If we look for examples of that in Austin and can't find any, it proves that the current code doesn't allow it. It proves that we're failing on that metric. There are examples of that happening. That happened in Houston. It happened internationally. There was a story, I think it was in Melbourne, Australia, where they dramatically increased supply and all the rents started dropping. But even in Houston, there was a story about that a couple years ago. So that, and that's, I mean, frankly, I think we have passed a direction in May so that we're not continually relitigating these issues. And I'm concerned about adding more data requests to staff work when we have given a very aggressive timeline. And I don't want to bog down staff work answering questions that at least the majority of the council has already felt ready to move past. But I do agree with Councilmember Poole about there may be future, deep dives into areas of conflict or other revisions. I think that's specifically why we want to go faster. We want to think about this as an iterative process and a funnel down to final implementation, where we started with the broad LDC direction we did. That will get down to a more specific document. We'll do first reading in December, hopefully adoption in January, February, and then the little minor details and pieces that we may have to tweak moving forward. Although we've not done that with all the various conflicts that exist in the current code, and we seem to be building a city pretty rapidly in that case. So I want to just thank staff. Y'all are doing a bang-up job on this, and I really like seeing the continual updates and clarifying your interpretation of the policy that we passed, or the direction that we passed, because as I noted earlier, we gave you a long document without any sense of priority or which, even conflict within that, and which one would govern. And so it's great to hear how you all are working through systems to address that. So good work.
Okay. Ann?
Thank you. I would echo that. I really appreciate the work you all are doing under tight timelines. So thank you so much. I want to daylight one issue for you that I don't expect an answer today, along the lines of what the mayor did. And that issue is just, and it relates to number 6, the housing capacity and yield. At some point, I'll want to understand, and I'm already getting some questions from the public about how the goals that we set for capacity related to the corridors and related to districts, how those get translated into your efforts for mapping. So again, I don't expect an answer today, but I think that whatever your take is on that, that's something that folks are going to want to understand. So I wanted to highlight that. So then I do have 2 quick questions, and those relate to page 5. I wanted to go back to Councilmember Cassar had highlighted the statement, existing market rate affordable multifamily shall not be mapped to be upzoned. I just want to verify what I think I heard y'all say earlier, that particular criteria, as well as other criteria, applies in the transition zones. So when you're looking at context sensitive for transition areas, can I assume that that's one of the components that you're looking at?
Restate the question.
Well, okay, sorry. One of the policy guidance items that Councilmember Cassar highlighted was existing market rate affordable multifamily shall not be mapped to be upzoned. So I'm just assuming that you mentioned earlier that in looking at transition zones, you're looking at context-sensitive criteria. I'm just wanting to confirm my assumption that particular statement out of the policy guidance is one of the statements that you all are using when you're considering how you map the transition zones.
Good morning, Mayor and Council members. Lindy Garwood, Planning and Zoning. I believe that is one of the criteria that we are including, but our mapping team will be able to talk more effectively to that next week when we present on the transition zones. So I do believe that's correct, but I would like them to confirm whether that's the case in your meeting next week.
Okay, that's fine. And then the last question I have is, you referred a couple of times to downtown. I'm just wanting to make sure when we use those terms, so I understand the area. So are we talking about the CBD, the Central Business District, or are we talking about a particular area of downtown? The reason I'm asking is because I think there were a couple of, I know you're going to talk more next time about the approach to downtown, because you've got that on the agenda for next time. I just want to know what we mean, or what you guys mean when you're talking about that area, in terms of the geography of it.
Again, Lindy Garwood, Planning and Zoning. I believe that when Brent mentioned downtown, he was specifically talking about the area that's included in the DAP, the Downtown Austin Plan. We can talk more effectively to that in the next meeting as well, like you mentioned. But again, what Brent was saying is that we're not planning on doing any base entitlement upzoning in downtown, and that would be in the DAP area.
Well, I'll have to go back and look at the DAP area, but some areas, and I'm just not as familiar, go as far north as they go north of what we consider to be, what I consider to be the downtown area. So I'm just wanting to understand the limits of that. But I can go back, and if it's the Downtown Austin Plan, I can go back and look at those criteria. So I would just want to understand what the geography of that is. Okay.
Yes, and we can provide a map of that. It's primarily the areas that we're discussing for CC and DC zoning, which is the new CBD.
Do you know how far north it goes?
I wouldn't want to
That's all right if you
speak
don't.
incorrectly on that,
That's okay.
we can provide a map next week.
Okay, thank you.
And Councilmember Kitchen, I want to just briefly address one of your questions, and it relates to what Councilmember Kassar said as well. I think every statement in council's direction, staff are trying to find a way to give effect to those statements, but there are some that are challenging. There are some that present technical challenges, planning challenges, and in terms of mapping, I know that our staff that are working very diligently on the map with our guidance are considering existing market rate housing in the mapping, but it's difficult. It's very difficult to tie map designations to existing conditions of individual properties on a lot-by-lot basis. So I think when we come back to you with information on how we're implementing that direction, you'll find that it does factor in, but it's a difficult item to follow literally on a lot-by-lot basis. So I think just wait for us to provide you more information, and we'll make sure that we're prepared to address that when we talk about mapping.
Okay, that's fine. You can explain the difficulties then. That would be fine. I just wanted to make sure that was one of the policy factors that apply to the transition zone. So, okay, thank you.
Okay. Anything else on this? Yes, Leslie.
So on the page 5, under draft 3, that first bullet said approach to increase housing capacity did not include transition zones. Is that because we mostly were talking about volume and step downs and compatibility with what's on the transition corridor, with what's on the activity corridor on the main streets? Can you explain that first bullet under the draft 3 box, what you meant by that?
Councilmember Poole, are you specifically asking about draft 3 increasing housing capacity, in the transition zone? How that applied to draft 3?
So, on page 5, the box that says draft 3, it says approach to increase housing capacity did not include transition zones. And I was saying, if that's the case, because I remember talking a lot about transition zones, and we were talking about capacity a lot. We talked about how if we allowed VMU on all transit corridors, we could get more than the capacity that we need, right then and there on traffic corridors. I remember talking about transition zones a lot, so I wanted to understand the meaning of this, and was it because we were mostly talking about transition zones as the opportunity to step down into neighborhoods from the high impact transportation corridors?
So
I don't understand this statement here.
Councilmember Poole, I think the term transition areas is probably used in different contexts in different planning efforts, but as we're talking about it here, we very specifically mean a transition that's focused on providing missing middle housing that sort of steps down from corridors. And while in our prior work there were definitely instances where there was increased capacity through zoning to be provided along the corridors, the concept of transition areas, as spelled out in Council's policy direction, and that will be reflected in the map that comes forward, that was not part of it. I think earlier, maybe in draft 1, there was, I think, a nod to the concept of transition areas, but I don't think it was as concretely defined as the direction that Council provided on May 2nd.
I'll have to go back and look at that. But I do remember it was compatibility that we were focused on. And maybe we weren't calling them transition zones. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think there were definitely changes to compatibility, and that relates broadly to the concept of some kind of transition. But in the sense that we're talking about here, of really providing enhanced unit yields through missing middle housing types, different housing choices along corridors, stepping down as you get further into the neighborhood.
Right.
That was just not as focused a concept in our prior work as it is now.
I think that may be because we just didn't get to it. I think that was something when we pulled the plug a year ago. I think it wasn't in August, September when we stopped the Code Next process. It could be that we just hadn't gotten to that, but I remember this was very definitely on our plates and how we were going to manage the compatibility, the step downs, the transitioning from our high impact traffic corridors, and then the relative quiet and safety concern for neighbors who live in the neighborhoods who have kids playing in yards and streets. Thanks.
Okay, Greg?
I think rather than even having to pull that much information or data, I remember during the last process that some folks brought forward data within Austin showing how much more affordable missing middle housing types that exist in Austin were than single-family detached homes built in the same year in Austin are. So I think we actually just have even information here on the ground in our city today about how missing middle housing types provide that level of affordability, and that may just be a useful resource. As far as finding that more affordable existing multifamily, I remember during the Code Next process that a lever was presented to us as a voting option that was like buildings built before 1990 that were multifamily being upzoned versus not being upzoned. So I imagine you guys are looking and have that tool. I know it's not easy, but I think we had that. And then on the housing capacity piece, I do think that the more open source it can be how it is that we got to our housing capacity numbers, then the fewer questions it might be that we encounter from people about how it is that we got to that information, just so that people can mess around with our assumptions themselves, and we can try to get to the best answer. But I think that this chart and the way you guys have laid it out is really useful for the public. So thank you for all of this, because I think that this gets it so that there's very little surprise when this comes in on October 4th, how it is that y'all interpreted the May action to the October 4th release. So thank you.
Okay, yeah.
I guess initially I hesitate to respond to some comments that I disagree with, but I think it's important to respond, and I hope we're not going to get into these broad, back and forth as we continue to have this discussion. So this is less for staff, but thank you for staff for all that you have done thus far, and I think we're on the right track, and I think you have gotten the right interpretation of what we asked for in that really large policy document. I don't, when I hear things like we haven't seen how increased housing has lowered rents in Austin. Austin, I'm trying to think of a comparison, and Austin has been one of the most environmentally friendly cities with increasing our renewables and our solar and protecting our salamanders and protecting our trees. Yet we still have climate change. It's happening. And we don't say we're going to stop doing all these policy recommendations for environmental reasons. We're not going to stop because climate change is happening, and what are we going to do? And that's when I hear we're not seeing rental prices go down, to me it doesn't make any sense to me. That we say that market rate housing does not have an effect. We're not building it fast enough is what the problem is, why we're not seeing the effect of prices going down. When we hear that 150 people are moving here a day, do we have 150 units a day coming online? I don't know. I don't think so. I hate to get into this back and forth about the market, but it's so hard to hear market arguments when it comes to we can't upzone things because the market's going to do these things, but then we don't pay attention to the market for simple things like supply and demand. Like it doesn't make any sense to me, and we can't stop people from moving here. We should be welcoming new people, but also understanding that we are displacing people if we don't build market rate housing. I read an article, I think just yesterday, about some big Google exec who realized that the rents in San Francisco were too high, so they came to Austin, bought some land. They're going to build a house here because it's so much more affordable. And people are moving to Austin that can afford $1 million homes. And those people, I want to make sure they're not displacing people in districts like mine, because those families are leaving because they are getting priced out, and we need that market stock. So thank you, and I look forward to this continued conversation.
Okay, Allison.
So I wasn't going to comment again on the other stuff, but I think that there's a piece here that's just important to explain is that no one is saying that we shouldn't create more market rate units. My concern is the entitlements that we give for market rate and how we do that impacts our ability to deliver the supply of affordable units, and the choices that we make affect that. And so that's a nuance there. It is not saying we don't need more housing. It is saying that when we give entitlements, then there's no incentive, even no matter what our bonus is. If we give a certain set of entitlements for free with no requirement for affordability, and unfortunately we don't have tools that other states do, then that means that we are less likely to get the affordable units if we're not careful. And that is part of what I am trying to communicate. And so that is drilling down a little bit more into supply to think about what kind of supply do we want and what is the interaction between the market rate and the affordable units. And I don't think that is settled. It's not settled in economics. And so that is the difference of opinion and the nuance that I am looking at. I am no way saying we don't need more market rate units. I did have a question for staff, which is why I had my light on. So in the definition in your response to Councilmember Poole, with respect to defining the transition zone, you said it was about promoting missing middle there. Can you explain the definition of missing middle you're using within the transition zone? Because we had a very broad definition when we were approaching that ranged from 2 units to 36 units or something like that. And when you talk about the transition zone and the possibilities there, it would be helpful to understand the scope of the missing middle that you're talking about.
Yes, thank you. Lindy Garwood, Planning and Zoning. We're primarily looking at 2 zones for the transition area. Those zones are still in flux, and we're working on finalizing those. I believe that we will be closer to something that we can present at the transition area discussion next week, where we can actually discuss what that transition and missing middle looks like. But we're primarily looking at 2 zones that are not as high or dense as anything that would be on the corridor.
So you'll hopefully answer my question next week. And
Yes.
That's fine. Thank you.
All right, I think we're Leslie.
And then will we have an opportunity to see sort of a test case when you come and present to us with the final or the draft maps in October, where you pull out 2 or 3 different specific situations and model it for us so we can see the impact of the draft text?
Yes, we can do that. And that will be part of the public testing as well.
Okay. And you'll bring it to us here in a work session so we can see it in this forum as well?
We certainly could.
I think that would be really helpful. Thanks.
All right, I think we're ready. Let's go on to the next briefing. Thank you very much. Come back often.
And Mayor Council, that is a goal to really ensure that we are having as many points of contact with the council and community as we move forward to really adhere to the policy direction and the timelines that were given to staff from the May 5th document.